You are gripping a synthetic branch with feet designed like living clamps, one eye tracking a cricket in a plastic cup, the other watching nothing in particular because your species treats surveillance as a default state rather than a response to specific threat, and you weigh less than a slice of bread, and you live inside a glass terrarium in someone's apartment where rain falls from a misting nozzle on timer settings more precise than weather has ever been. Heat arrives from a bulb above. Water arrives as droplets on leaves that are not real. Food arrives dusted with calcium because another species has taken a professional interest in your bone density, and your ancestors survived drought and predators and forests that changed by season and parasites that would end most other animals. And you, meanwhile, become visibly distressed when humidity drops 3%. There is a vine in your enclosure made of plastic, a sun that runs on electricity, a life so carefully managed that it represents a kind of insult to everything that produced you, and then your owner dies. Not eventually. Not after calling someone who knows reptiles. Now, in the next room, a body stops, and because you are a chameleon, the apocalypse arrives as a single misting cycle. That is the entire opening statement of your crisis. One absent burst of water. No thunder, no signal, just a leaf that should be wet and is not. Day 1. The basking lamp still works. Day 2. The room cools slightly at night in a way your body registers before your behavior reflects it. Day 3. The dripper reservoir empties. Day 4. Dehydration begins its invisible work, thickening blood and slowing the chemical processes that movement depends on, and you conserve energy because conservation is the oldest instruction your lineage carries. But conservation in a sealed enclosure with no caretaker is a different equation than conservation in the wild. In the wild, patience is strategy. Here it is just delay, and then chance arrives wearing the form of a house cat chasing a moth across the top of the terrarium, and the lid that was never properly clipped because he never tries to escape slides open 4 centimeters, and the cat loses interest immediately because cats are entropy with fur. But the gap remains, and you do not move toward it quickly. Because you are a chameleon and quick is not your language, you spend 6 hours assessing whether the new geometry of the world is acceptable, and at dusk, thirst makes the decision that deliberation had been postponing. You climb upward and squeeze through the gap and descend a curtain and enter a space with distances that have no reference point in your experience. The apartment is vast and dry and full of surfaces that make no evolutionary sense. You cross a bookshelf over the course of 40 minutes. You drink condensation from a bathroom sink at midnight, standing in the dark like something from a dream about the wrong animal in the wrong place. You catch 2 fruit flies near a trash bin and miss 3 more because hunting without branches is a problem your body was not configured to solve. And 2 weeks of this depletes what the enclosure's final days left you with, and then a storm finds a window latched but not shut and pushes it wider, and rain scent enters the apartment like information from a part of your inheritance you have never needed to access before, and you move toward it with the slowness that is not hesitation but precision. And outside is suburban Florida, which matters more than almost any other variable in this story because Florida is warm enough to forgive the mistakes of an animal still learning what outside means. And the ficus hedge you reach by dawn has real leaves and real insects and real sun, and also a hawk sitting 2 trees over. But the important thing is that it has real leaves, and the first year edits the escaped population with the directness that only unmediated consequence achieves. Birds take the ones whose colors still lean toward the decorative. Dehydration removes the ones whose physiology was too narrowly calibrated for the controlled environment. Cold snaps erase entire pockets of animals that had moved too far from the urban warmth that was protecting them without their knowledge. And what remains after the first year is a population selected not by any preference, but by the specific overlap between what the environment asked and what each animal was able to provide. The ones that tolerate lower humidity without behavioral collapse. The ones less stressed by open habitat, the ones with slightly faster tongues and slightly better camouflage against the ornamental plants of suburban Florida rather than the forest floors of Madagascar. And 10 years out there are small breeding populations in canal margins and abandoned neighborhoods and fruit groves and the overgrown yards of houses that no one is maintaining. And they are not pets anymore, but they are not wild in any ancestral sense either. They are something the language does not have a precise word for, descended from captive bloodlines and shaped by a suburban ecosystem that was itself neither natural nor fully artificial. Their colors have moved away from the displays that made them valuable in pet stores and toward the greens and bark browns that are harder to resolve from above. When you are a hawk deciding whether something is worth the dive, Their fear response has sharpened because the calmest temperaments were the first ones taken, handling tolerance being a trait with negative survival value in a world where everything reaching toward you has teeth or talons. 50 years out, and the urban canopy has become a habitat that no ecologist planned for and every chameleon descendant has found. Power lines holding vines, buildings generating warm microclimates on their south-facing walls, ruined fences becoming branch networks connecting green corridors that no city planner intended to create, and the feet have broadened slightly for ornamental species with smoother bark, and the tails have strengthened because falls onto concrete are not recoverable, the way falls onto forest floor sometimes are, and the eyes have shifted in lineages that hunt at dawn and dusk to avoid the peak activity windows of the birds that have been learning them. And then something happens that the original animal's solitary nature would not have predicted, which is that loose social tolerance begins to emerge not from any impulse toward companionship, but from the simple arithmetic of clustered resources. Females den near productive moisture zones. Juveniles remain in shared thickets where a neighbor freezing in threat response is information worth having, and the individuals that survived because another animal's stillness warned them pass that tendency toward proximity on, not as culture, not as choice, but as the accumulated statistical advantage of noticing danger half a second earlier than the ones who didn't. 500 years out and Florida has rearranged itself, coastlines moved, suburbs consumed by forest and swamp, the bones of roads still present under layers of root and soil, and the chameleons have split into answers to different questions. In mangrove zones, a long-snouted salt-tolerant lineage hunts crabs and flies and drinks rain off waxy leaves. Inland canopy forms have grown to nearly cat-sized, their tongues striking at birds' nestlings when the opportunity presents itself. The hyoid structures supporting the strike reinforced across generations by the selection pressure of prey that moves faster and weighs more than a cricket. In scrublands, a dwarf terrestrial form sprints between bushes and uses camouflage only when stillness is cheaper than motion, which is an inversion of the original strategy, but an accurate response to a different landscape. 10,000 years out, and several distinct species exist across warm latitudes. A canopy glider with extended ribs and skin membranes evolved from display structures launches between trees because forests reward not falling, and anything that falls less reproduces more. A trunk form uses horned skull displays to resolve disputes without lethal contact because lethal contact is expensive and display is cheaper if the other animal reads it correctly. A nocturnal giant with enlarged turret eyes takes bats at cave mouths, with a tongue strike so fast the prey has not finished being surprised before it is over. 100,000 years out, and climate cycles have isolated and reconnected populations repeatedly in the way that isolation and reconnection have always accelerated divergence. Some lineages have moved toward greater parental investment, because in predator-heavy environments, the math of egg guarding produced more surviving offspring than the math of abandonment. Others have become live-bearing in cooler uplands where eggs failed too often to remain the default reproductive strategy. And 1 million years after the misting cycle was missed for the first time, dawn reaches the canopy of a drowned city where strangler figs have grown taller than the buildings they replaced, and something moves through the upper branches with the deliberate confidence of an animal that has not needed to hurry for a very long time. It is nearly a meter long, including tail, laterally compressed, ridged along the spine in a way that breaks its outline against bark and leaf. Simultaneously, its colors shifting between patterns so accurate that the eye refuses to resolve them until movement betrays the boundary between animal and background. Each eye tracks its own hemisphere of the world, and then both converge forward for 1 second of binocular precision when the distance to a target requires exact measurement, and below in the canopy, a group of small arboreal mammals is feeding on fruit, and the predator watches without moving for 20 minutes because patience compounded across 1 million years of selection is not patience anymore. It is architecture. And then one mammal steps onto an exposed branch and the tongue fires, and there is no interval between before and after that any observer could measure. And nearby juveniles are watching from concealment, not because anyone arranged for them to watch, but because watching is what survives in animals, whose ancestors watched and the ones who didn't are not here. And somewhere in the deep structure of this animal's nervous system, there is still a ghost. A faint and purposeless preference for droplets forming on leaves at regular intervals, a residue of timed nozzles and calcium-dusted crickets, and the particular quality of light that comes through glass rather than canopy. It does nothing. It connects to nothing that still exists. It is simply what remains when everything else has been overwritten by sufficient time and sufficient pressure. Rain begins, and the animal tilts its head upward and drinks directly from the falling water. The branch sways, the forest continues its business. And the creature that once required a specific outlet and a calibrated timer and another species' constant attention has become what difficult environments always produce from whatever material they are given, which is something quieter than you expected, stranger than you planned for, and considerably harder to kill than it ever appeared when it was sitting still.